Chapter 4. It was all much harder than he had thought it was going to be, which of course might be said for Brian's whole life since the plane crash. But in this case, he had somewhere to start. He had made the lighter bow and had tried to make slightly heavier bows, and he thought that making a really powerful weapon would be simply like doubling the smaller ones. It was more than double, because everything was stronger. There were difficulties that would not have occurred to him. Rain came on the third day of drying the heavy bows. Luckily, Brian thought they hadn't dried enough and set them inside the shelter until the rain stopped. Except that it didn't stop. In the summer, when it rained, it might last half a day or even a full day, but then it cleared off and dried out. Even violent storms, like the tornado that had caught him and brought the plane up, were short-lived. But this was fall, and fall rains were the whole new dimension in weather. It started to rain from a low gray sky, and it didn't rain hard, and it didn't rain soft. It just kept raining. Brian almost went crazy with it. By the end of the first whole day, it was all he could do to find dry wood to keep the fire going. By the end of the second day of constant drizzle, he found himself looking at the sky, hoping to see a hole, anything with bright light. But it rained steadily for 5 days, and while it rained, it turned colder, so that by the 5th day, Brian felt as if he were freezing. The only way he could find dry wood was by looking for dead logs that had hung up off the ground, and then by breaking limbs off beneath them where they weren't quite as soaked as they were on top. By the time he got enough wood to burn for a few hours and keep the fire going against the rain, he was so soaked that it took all the time the wood burned just to get him warm and dry enough to go out again to search for more wood. The inside of his sleeping bag was damp at first, and then flat and wet, and finally as soaked from his body in the humidity as if it had been out in the open rain. But still worse, with the rain he did not think he could hunt, so he had no food. On the 4th day, he found a 4-pound northern pike on his fish line, and he ate it all at one sitting, saving the guts and head for bait. But he got no more fish, and by the 6th day, when it was clear that it wasn't going to stop raining, he believed now that it would never stop raining. By the end of the 6th day, he decided that he would simply have to live in cold rain for the rest of his life. In the morning of the 7th day, he sat in his bag, looked outside, and said, "To hell with it, I'm going hunting." And he did. He strung his bow and took his arrows, and after touching his medicine arrow for good luck, and in a tattered t-shirt with a hunting knife at his belt, he set off into the rain. Hunting took his mind off the cold, and he was found, to his immense surprise, that hunting was better during a rain than it was in clear weather. Game could hole up for a day or two of bad weather, but animals were governed by the same physics as Brian, and rain or no rain, cold or no cold, they had to come out and eat. He took a fool bird not 40 feet from the camp and got 4 shots at 2 different rabbits within another 20 yards. He missed the rabbits, but was satisfied with the fool bird and went back to build up a sputtering fire one more time and made a hot stew, including the heart and liver and a tough muscle he thought must be the gizzard, which he had come to like, and ate it all before falling sound asleep in his wet bag. He slept hard in spite of being cold and damp, but in the middle of the night he opened his eyes instantly awake and waited for his eyes and mind to tell him what wakened him. No noise. Nothing. And then he realized it had stopped. There was no rain falling, and he peeked out of the shelter to see a night sky filled with stars and a sliver of a moon that he looked up at them and said softly, "Thank you," and he went back to sleep. In the morning it was cold, truly cold. He saw his breath in the dawn sunlight coming through the opening, and when he looked outside, he saw a ring of ice 4 or 5 feet out from the edge of the lake all around the shore. He stood up out of the bag, shivering, and got the fire going until it blazed merrily, and then sat close to it, watching the sun come up while he warmed himself. When he had stopped shivering, he brought his sleeping bag outside and spread it in the sunlight away from the fire so that no sparks would hit it, and left it there to dry. Within an hour, the temperature was in the comfort range, and Brian stretched and let the sun cook his bones for a few minutes. The ground was still damp, but he sat on a dry rock and looked at the blue sky and felt the hot sun, and it was as if the days and days of rain had never happened. A kind of lethargy came over him, and he just wanted to sit in the sun and try to forget the last week. He closed his eyes and dozed for a few minutes, but a new sound, high and almost cackling, cut into his doze, and he opened his eyes to see a flock of geese high above, heading south, migrating. It was a reminder. It did not get things done sitting, and in the back of his mind was the thought that what he had just had was a warning. A week of cold rain to show him how poor he was, how completely unready he was for what he knew now was coming. And today, the geese to cap it. He must work now, work hard, or he would not make it. No matter how nice the weather might be, he knew he had no time left. First, the shelter. He had to make the shelter cold-proof and rain-proof. That meant sealing the fire inside and closing the door in some way. But he thought the smoke would drive him out. Still, he thought, they did it. The people who came before him had tents and teepees and caves, and they did not have stoves, so how did they do it? He took kindling into the shelter and made a small fire, and closed off the opening to see what would happen. As he had predicted, the smoke quickly filled the small enclosure and drove him coughing and spitting out into the air. He had to let the smoke out. They must have known a way. What did they do? Teepees just let it come out the top through a hole. He'd seen that in movies, old westerns on television. Brian went to where the wall met the rock and made a hole about a foot across just above where he had made the fire, and then tried it all again. This time, when he closed the door and put some sticks on the fire to start it and started to smoke again, but as the heat developed, it rose and carried a small draft through the hole in the ceiling. There was a moment of smoke, and then it all magically cleared, and Brian was sitting in a snug little hut with a fire warming his face. Clearly, it would take only a small blaze to keep the little shelter warm, which meant less wood would be required. The side of the shelter was still far from airtight, but about this, Brian knew exactly what to do. He had spent one whole day watching a family of beaver mix mud and sticks to make a watertight dam. He spent 3 hours bringing up double armfuls of fresh mud from the lake to pack into the low wall with sticks and leaves. When he was done, he covered it with another layer of brush to protect the mud, and when it dried by nightfall, he had a truly weather-tight shelter. He still had to seal the door, but that night he sat with a fire warming the inside of his home, and he knew that as long as he had wood and he was living in the middle of a forest, he would stay warm no matter what kind of weather came. He slept so soundly that the bear could have come in again and torn the place apart, and he would not have known it. In the morning, he mudded the door and set it aside to dry and used more mud to make a seal on the wall, smooth and tight. Then he set back to work on the arrowhead problem. He went to the lakeshore and looked for stones that would make an arrowhead. There were rocks everywhere, and he must have looked at 100, turning them this way and that, tapping them against each other. None of them worked or fit or seemed right, and he stopped and thought again about the arrowhead collection. They weren't just stones in the shape of arrowheads. They had been worked, chiseled some way from larger stones to get the shape and the edge. But what kind of stone and how? Wasn't it some special type of rock, something that would flake off in sharp edges? He had his hatchet on his belt and went to the shore and started hitting rocks with the flat side of the hatchet. They just shattered and didn't make any kind of sharp point. One rock chipped off a flake about 3 inches long and in the right shape, but he picked it up and picked up the flake and tapped it with the back of the hatchet, and it fell into a dozen unusable pieces. Flint. There, the word came to him. They weren't just arrowheads, they were flint arrowheads. Maybe they had to be flint to chip right. So all he had to do was find some flint. He went back to the lake shore and looked at the rock supply again, smashing rocks with the back of the hatchet to see if any of them were made of flint. In truth, he didn't really know what to look for, except that he remembered the flint and steel would spark when they hit. He had smashed 4 or 5 more rocks looking for sparks when it came to him. There was a rock embedded in the wall of his shelter. He had thrown his hatchet at the porcupine the night he got stuck in the leg, and the hatchet had showered sparks and led him to make a fire. It was there in the fire rock. He had forgotten the rock because there had been matches and lighters in the survival pack he'd retrieved from the plane, and he didn't have to use the rock again. He went and looked at it for the first time in more than a month, studied it. It was a dark rock. It had depth and seemed to have fracture lines or flaws in it. He struck it with the hatchet and smiled when he saw sparks, remembering the night the porcupine had come. But the rock didn't shatter or flake. He looked at it from a different angle and saw a small ridge, a little more than a line, and this time he aimed carefully and struck the line with the blunt corner of the hatchet, using a sharp tap with a little more muscle. This time it cracked, and a flake as wide as 2 fingers and 3 inches long fell to the ground beneath the rock. He picked it up. Ouch! He dropped it. The edge was as sharp as a razor, and it cut his finger slightly. He sucked the blood away and picked up the flake more carefully. It turned it to the light. It had a slightly oval shape, pointed on one end and rounded on the other. Both sides leading down to a point were so sharp they would shave hair off the back of his arm. All it needed to make it a true arrowhead was a pair of notches, one on either side of the rounded end. He put the flake on a flat rock and held it in place with his foot, vicing it down tightly while he chipped away at the notch positions with the tip of his hunting knife. He started with too big a piece, and it broke the whole tip of the oval off and left the flake with a flat rear end. From then on, he took tiny chips, each no bigger than the head of a pin, until he had an arrowhead that resembled those in the collection. It was not as finished as well as the ancients had finished theirs, but it was sharp and tapered the right way, and had a notch for tying it onto the shaft. He took one of the shafts for the war bow's arrows and split the grain on the end with a knife. He worked the point back into the splint so that the notch was slightly recessed into the wood. He had nothing with which to tie it into position, and was casting around for a piece of string, non-existent except for the original bowstring from his first bow, or he would have used it long ago, when he saw the tree with the rabbit skins. Whenever he took a rabbit, he skinned it carefully and stretched the skin on the sides of an oak, holding it with wooden pegs driven into the bark until it was dry. Had he not found a use for the skins yet, but he hated to waste anything he thought something might come along. When they dried, they were like thick paper with hair on one side, dry and crinkly and easy to tear. But the last hide he'd put up during the rain had not dried yet, and he took it off the tree. Still damp, the hide had a strength to it and might make a kind of cord. He used the knife to cut strips from the rabbit skin, and used one of the rawhide strips to tightly wrap and tie the point onto the split shaft. When he was finished, it seemed to be tight enough, and he had heard that rawhide shrinks when it dries, so that might make it even better. Of course, the hair was still on the skin and stuck out all around and made the arrow look like a pom-pom. But a quick pass over the flames in the fire pit burned all the hair off, and when he was done, he trimmed the ends of the lacing, and it looked good. Almost professional. He set the shaft aside and went back to the fire rock. He was already thinking of it as the arrow stone, and scrutinized it once more. Where he had broken the flake off it left two more edges, lines that looked like the same as the first one, and he used the back of the hatchet to strike them the way he'd hit the first one. Two more flakes came off, almost identical to the first one, and left two more lines. When he had tapped those, it happened again and again until he had 9 flake points. He took them back to his work rock and clamped them with his foot, and worked tie notches into the shanks with the point of his knife, and fitted them to the shaft with green rabbit hide, and all of this rocked to points in one day. Just as bad things could snowball, Brian found that good things could come fast as well. While he was working with the rabbit skin in the cool evening, he turned it to get a better angle, and the hair brushed his hand and felt warm, and he realized he'd found a way to stay warm. He had 15 dried skins, and he brought them into the shelter at dark. He had not eaten again, but the hunger was not as bad now because he was excited. Working in the firelight, he trimmed the hides to make them clean-edged and rectangular. He used one hide for lacing, cutting thin strips off the edge with his knife. The first aid scissors were too small to help, and started lacing the others together to form a rectangle. It took some time because he had no needle, and used the point of the knife to punch a small hole through the sides of the hide, and then a sharpened twig to push the lacing through. Although the laces weren't long, and he could only sew 7 or 8 inches before he had to tie it off and use a new lace, and by the time he had 4 hides sewn together, he could feel exhaustion taking him down. He crawled into his bag and slept hard, and didn't awaken until well after dawn. Hunger awakened with him, and he knew he had to hunt before he worked more on the hides, so he took the light bow and arrows and went to the foolbird area. This time, luck wasn't with him, and he missed 3 birds before he got a shot at a rabbit that hit. He cleaned it and used the green hide for lacing, and started sewing again while his stew cooked, and before he knew it, he was back in the shelter again, working in the light from the fire, his stomach full and his fingers flying. But this time, before he fell asleep, he had finished sewing the rabbit skins into a rectangle roughly 2 feet wide by nearly 6 feet long. It would make a good rug, he said, crawling into the bag to sleep at what he thought must be 3 or 4 in the morning. Just before sleep came, he heard the wolves. It sounded like 2 of them, high, keening howls as they sang to each other in the crash in the brush as they chased something, maybe a deer. He had not heard from them in almost 2 weeks. There would have been a time when the howls would have frightened him, given him an eerie feeling, but now he smiled. They must have gotten caught in the weather if it had taken them so long to run a circuit of their range, and he supposed they would mark the edge of their territory on the way through. He would have to go up and remark his own. The rains would have taken the smell away, the first thing in the morning. Good hunting, he thought, at the wolves. Have a good hunt. A good hunt was everything.